I'm Jasmine Moulton, and this is Reality Check. Reality Check is a new show here at True North where we use facts and logic to debunk the favorite arguments of the left. Every week we'll debunk one common leftist argument from Canada. And if you're new to the show, last week we covered the topic of free tuition. The Greens and the NDP, for example, are proposing that we completely abolish tuition in Canada. Obviously, we delivered a reality check that not only is this a regressive policy, but actually the reality is government debt is a far bigger burden on students than the average, even doctoral student loan. Now, while the legacy media gives leftists a platform to spread these sort of ideological claims, Reality Check is the only show in Canada with the explicit purpose to push back against these baseless claims. So if you appreciate the work that we do here at True North and you think this is an important program and you want more Canadians to hear what we have to say, then please help support the show. Go to donate.tnc.news. Now to this week's show. Now, with kids returning to school next week, now is the perfect time to debunk some common leftist claims about public school education funding in Canada. I know I've already seen a ton of posts on social media, Facebook, even Twitter, all talking about how cuts to education are happening in Canada or over the course of the past few years, and how these cuts are hurting our kids. And a lot of this comment is just recycled from different teachers' unions' paid advertising campaigns. But nonetheless, I think that we have to address this issue because there's so much false information and false claims floating around the internet. Take a listen.
Teachers came from across the province with a message for the government. 170 busloads from 5 different unions. Upset about proposed changes, including the loss of almost 3,500 positions over 4 years and larger high school class sizes. Unions say some classes could have 40 or 45 students.
That's insane. Right now, I have 33 kids in each of my classes, and I can barely fit all my desks in there as it is.
That particular clip that you just saw was a protest happening in Ontario back in 2020. But a lot of these education-related, oftentimes unionized protests all have the same themes in common. As you saw, if you're watching this on YouTube, perhaps you're listening to the podcast, you may have seen people holding signs saying, "Stop the cuts to education, cuts hurt our kids." In this particular clip, you even saw a child that obviously her parents brought her to the protest, holding a sign saying, "Don't cut my future." So to summarize, the left has two main arguments when it comes to education funding in Canada. The first, they'll say, stop the cuts, meaning education funding, they're arguing, has decreased or is decreasing, is being rolled back. And the second claim that they'll make is that cuts hurt kids, meaning every time these quote unquote cuts happen, kids perform worse. So if you increase education funding, student outcomes will improve. All right, so now the fun part. Let's debunk these two claims that one, education funding is going down in Canada, and two, that if you increase it, outcomes will improve. Let's start with argument one, that education funding in Canada is decreasing. The easiest leftist myths to debunk are when Stats Canada provides data that just so clearly paints the picture that the leftists are wrong. And we're in luck. The Fraser Institute has compiled a report using Statistics Canada data that shows that the growth in per student funding has outpaced both inflation and student enrollment. The study, titled Education Spending in Public Schools in Canada, states this: "It is clear from the data that from the 2013-14 school year to 2017-18, Canada has increased education spending in public schools beyond what was required for enrollment and price changes, contrary to the general perception that education spending in public schools has been cut." So it really does not get more clear than that. Obviously, education spending has gone up faster than inflation and student enrollment. Specifically, the study found that when you adjust for increases in enrollment and inflation, the actual increase in education spending across Canada over this time period was about 3.8%, which equates to, again, in real terms, about $500 per student. $500 per student is no small sum. If you think about it, if you've got a class of 20 or 30 kids, that's a lot of money. And usually when leftists do make the argument that premiers are making cuts to education, their time frame of reference is pretty myopic, meaning they may look at small policy changes without considering the big picture over time. But overall, as I said, The trend is clear. Education funding in Canada is going up at a faster rate than inflation, and student enrollment are increasing. But the obvious leftist rebuttal is, okay, if education funding is going up as you say, then why are class sizes getting bigger? Now, this is a really important argument to address because a lot of times people say class sizes are getting bigger because education funding is going down. We just established education spending is going up. So valid question, let's explore it, let's dive in. The reason why class sizes are getting bigger despite education spending increasing is because most of the increases to education spending in Canada, in fact, the vast majority of the increases, go into compensation. Again, the Fraser Institute study that analyzed education spending in Canada found that the increase in compensation costs represents 73% of the total increase of $8.2 billion in education spending in public schools between 2013 and 2017. And this leads us nicely into leftist argument number 2, which is that cuts hurt kids, or in other words, we need to increase education spending in order to improve student outcomes. So as we just saw, a study has pointed out that 73% of increases to education spending went into compensation. That means that 73 cents out of every $1 new dollar going into education funding will go into compensation for people working within the public school system. So right off the bat, while the left says that increases to education spending will help students, the data actually shows that the vast majority of it will help people working for the public school system. And then almost guaranteed, the left retort to this will be, well, the better you take care of teachers, the better off students are. But one thing you'll never hear leftists admit is that the more you pay teachers, the fewer you can afford. And because of this very simple principle, it's obvious that teacher compensation is tied directly to class sizes. So let's dive into teacher compensation. I submitted access to information requests to the Ministry of Education in Ontario, inquiring about average teacher pay in the province, and I got the following response. The average high school teacher in Ontario earned a total compensation, which means salary plus benefits and taxpayer-funded pension contributions, of $103,926 in 2018. And that year was obviously more of a normalized year before any sort of pandemic-related fluctuation. Now, the 2018 school year was 194 days long. So that means that for each working day in class, teachers made $536 per working day. Now, that was just the average total compensation for Ontario high school teachers. Top earning teachers in Ontario earned a total compensation of $120,097 in 2018. Again, divided by the 194-day school year, that means that the top earning teachers were earning over $619 per day. And for context, this is compared to the median household income, so that could include 2 income earners in Ontario for that year was just over $61,000. My point here is a simple one. The more you pay teachers, the fewer you can afford. This is basic math. For example, if you had 100 teachers paid at $100,000 per year for that same amount of money, you could have 143 teachers paid at $70,000 a year. So if I haven't already overdone the point, the more you pay teachers, the fewer you can afford, and this has obvious implications on class size. Higher compensation means we can afford fewer teachers, and fewer teachers means class sizes get bigger. Therefore, it's increases to compensation, not decreases to education funding, that is causing class sizes to get bigger. And this leads us to the most important argument today of the show, which is this. As spending on public education in Canada has gone up, performance in our public schools has actually gone down. So PISA, which stands for Program for International Student Assessment, is an international test coordinated every few years by the OECD, and it's basically the gold standard for international educational performance. So this test means business. Now, right off the bat, it's important to acknowledge typically, Canadian students have performed pretty well on PISA, so they have ranked quite highly in comparison to other OECD countries. And oftentimes leftists will use this to say, look, we need to defend the status quo. We need to continue to spend more and more and more, dump more money into the same system because look, we rank highly internationally. But a clear and obvious rebuttal to this is that Canada has been slipping. Ever since they started benchmarking our scores in reading, science, and math, Canadian student scores have been on the decline. Consider this. Canadian scores in all 3 subjects of reading, math, and science have declined from the respective benchmarking year to 2018. Reading has declined from 534 points to 520, mathematics from 532 points to 512, and science from 534 points to 518. So right away, this should disprove the leftist claim that increasing education funding improves student outcomes, because as we've seen over this same period, education funding has increased, but our PISA scores have declined. Vincent Geloso, an economics professor and senior economist at the Montreal Economic Institute, points out in a recent article, Quebec data show that performance on PISA tests for mathematics has been quite stable, declining only 1.5% since 2006, even though spending per pupil has increased 18%. So Canada's been spending more and getting worse results. Why? Here's the problem with Canada's education system. Results have been going down despite increases in funding because Canada's public education system is a government-backed monopoly. Canadians know that monopolies create less choice, poorer service, and higher prices. So why do we tolerate the government's monopoly over public education? In Ontario and Atlantic provinces, if you want your tax dollars to follow your son or daughter wherever they're going to school, you have to send them to a government school. You have no choice. However, in other provinces, 35 to 80% of per pupil funding can follow students outside the government system. And this leads us to the solution. Canada's public education system needs more competition and more school choice for parents. Take a listen.
What we need to do in education is go to the full voucher system. You know, if you ask who are the customers of education, ultimately I think the customers are the parents, not even the students, but the parents. The problem that we have in this country is that the customers went away. The customers stopped paying attention to their schools for the most part. What happened was that mothers started working, and they didn't have time to spend at PTA meetings and watching their kids' school. Schools became much more institutionalized. Parents spent less and less and less time involved in their kids' education. What happens when a customer goes away and a monopoly gets control, which is what's happened in our country, is that the service level almost always goes down. I remember seeing a bumper sticker when the telephone company was all one, AT&T, the Bell system. I remember seeing a bumper sticker with the Bell logo on it, and it said, "We don't care. We don't have to." And that's what a monopoly is. That's what IBM was in their day, and that's certainly what the public school system is. They don't have to care. I believe very strongly that if the country gave each parent a voucher, a check for $4,400 that they could only spend at any accredited school, several things would happen. Number one, schools would start marketing themselves like crazy to parents to get students. Secondly, I think you see a lot of new schools starting. I've suggested as an example, if you go to Stanford Business School, they have a public policy track. They could start a school administrator track. So you could get a bunch of people coming out of college, tying up with somebody who just got out of business school. They could be starting their own schools.
There are, as you said, many blacks today who are still being given totally inadequate education, yes, cannot be expected to get very far for that reason. What would be your remedy for that?
I know. That's very easy. I would allow their parents to have a choice of where to send them to school, whether that choice is called a voucher scheme, open enrollment, tuition tax credit, any kind of scheme of that sort that would put that power in the hands of their parents. Mainly because that would mean that the schools would have to be responsive to them. As it is now, the school is a monopoly. They need not be responsive. I have relatives right here in New York whom I've had to intervene for because the schools would not even treat them decently, much less give them access to the information they wanted that they were entitled to under the law. It is hard for me to understand what harm is going to be done by allowing parents to have a choice as compared to having self-interested bureaucrats have a monopoly.
So if you're listening to the podcast version of the show, you might have recognized those voices, pretty famous. The first was Steve Jobs of Apple, and the second was respected economist Tom Sowell. Both were saying that the key to more successful public education is to increase school choice for parents. If you consider that the average per student funding in Canada in 2017 to the 2018 school year was $13,798, so close to $14,000. And actually that went as high as $16,038 in Saskatchewan, and the per student funding has only gone up since then. Imagine if you had that money as a form of voucher where you could choose where your son or daughter went to school. You can only imagine how that would change the incentive structures in public schools in Canada. So as a recap of today's show, when you hear leftists say that cuts to education are hurting our kids, you can easily shut down that argument by stating that education funding in Canada has outpaced both inflation and student enrollment. So no, cuts are not hurting our kids. What's hurting our kids, and the reason that their test scores are declining despite increased funding to the public school system, is the government monopoly over the public school system in Canada. Reality check: more choice, not more spending, will improve education in Canada. That's our show for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, please give us a 5-star review or like the show, share it on social media so that others can find Reality Check too. And don't forget to tune in next Wednesday for another episode. I'm Jasmine Moulton, and this is Reality Check.